Hello, and welcome to this morning's virtual information session on the proposed Beaverton Charter of 2021. My name is Cynthia Moffett, and I will be your MC for this event. While some of you may recognize me from my involvement on the City of Beaverton's Diversity Advisory Board, please note that I am not here as a representative of the board. I am hosting this event in an individual capacity as a Beaverton resident, just like many of you out there watching this morning. We are hosting this charter information session for you, the community, to learn more about this proposed ballot measure and to get your questions answered. Our format will first feature an informational presentation given by Jim Johnson, Senior Project Manager with the National Policy Consensus Center at Portland State University, which provides a neutral forum to assist cities, counties, and other government entities. Jim worked as the lead consultant with Beaverton City Council in facilitating the work sessions they held on charter review and in helping the Beaverton City Attorney's Office with potential language changes to the proposed charter. After the presentation, we will pivot to a panel of participants to take questions from the audience. Our Q&A panel will feature Jim Johnson, City Councilor Marc Soucie, one of the city councilors that advocated for this ballot measure, and Steve Smelley from the Beaverton Area Chamber of Commerce's Business Advocacy Council, who has come out in opposition of this measure. Should you wish to ask a question during this event, please use the chat feature that is available within this webcast. Please note that every attempt will be made to answer all questions in the order received in the time allotted. If your question does not get answered during this session, please email it to citymail@beavertonoregon.gov for it to be forwarded to the appropriate party to follow up. This event will be recorded for broadcast. The program will be aired on Tualatin Valley Community Television every day until the election at 6 a.m. on Channel 28 and 2 p.m. on Channel 30. Now let's get started. Jim will give his presentation, which features the PowerPoint slides he presented at the January 7th, 2020 Beaverton City Council meeting. A PDF of the PowerPoint slides is available on the Charter Virtual Information Sessions webpage, beavertonoregon.gov/charterinfosessions. A pre-recorded version of the presentation as a standalone video is also available on the same page. Jim, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. As Cynthia mentioned, my name is Jim Johnson. I work for the National Policy Consensus Center at Portland State University. My background is working in local government. I was the county administrator in Lane County for 9 years and the city manager in Eugene for about 5 years. I've been the interim city manager in the city of Roseburg and interim city administrator in the city of Cresswell and the city of Vernonia. In Beaverton, I helped the city council in their effort to review and revise the city charter. The council held 9 work sessions in open public meetings between September of 2019 and February of 2020. They also held 2 public hearings to receive public feedback on the proposed city charter. After these efforts, the council decided to submit to the voters of Beaverton a ballot measure proposing a revised city charter. My presentation will last about 10 minutes. It presents some basic facts about city charters and then a short summary of the revised charter on the May ballot. Next slide, please. I'm going to answer about 10 questions that exist about charters in general. What is a city charter? Why refer the proposed city charter for voter consideration? What are the common forms of government in Oregon that are shown in a charter? What forms of government were studied by the Beaverton Mayor and Council? What would the proposed city charter do if it's passed? What would be the role of elected officials under the proposed city charter? What would be the role of city officers under the proposed city charter? What are some next steps? What would be the cost to taxpayers if the measure passes? And lastly, what would happen if the proposed city charter does not pass? Next slide. What is a city charter? The federal government, U.S. federal government, and the state of Oregon each have constitutions. while cities in Oregon have charters. Constitutions and charters are foundational documents describing how the government is organized and how it will govern itself. They are the legal documents that define the organization, the powers, the functions, and essential procedures of the government. The U.S. Constitution describes the roles and powers of the President, Congress, and the Supreme Court. The Oregon Constitution describes the roles and powers of the governor, the legislature, and the state Supreme Court. And lastly, the City of Beaverton Charter describes the roles and powers of the mayor, the city council, and city officers. The charter describes the basic framework within which the city conducts its business. Next slide. Why refer the proposed city charter? It is common for cities and counties to periodically review their charters. The current city charter was approved by voters in November 1980, about 40 years ago, and was amended once in 2008 when voters changed a section relating to urban renewal. Next slide. What are the common forms of government in Oregon? There are 241 cities in Oregon. They're organized into 4 basic forms of government that are described in their charter. First is the mayor-council. Smaller Oregon cities typically have the mayor-council form, in which the legislative and policymaking body is through a popularly elected mayor and council. Second is the commission form. Portland is the only city in the state with the commission form of government, where the elected commissioners function collectively as the city council and serve as administrators of city departments. The third form is called the strong mayor. Beaverton is the only city in the state with the strong mayor form, which the mayor, serving as the chief executive officer, has the authority to appoint city staff, is responsible for city administration, and serves as the presiding officer at council meetings. Fourth is the council manager form. Most Oregon cities with populations over 2,500 have the council manager or council administrator form, in which the council hires and can fire a chief executive officer to be responsible for the daily supervision of city affairs. Next slide. What forms of government were studied by the mayor and council? As they considered the form of government for the future, the council focused on 2 of the 4 methods of governance. First is the current strong mayor form, and secondly, the council manager form of government. They looked at charters suggested by the National Civic League and the League of Oregon Cities. They reviewed charter language from a variety of cities in Oregon and around the country. Next slide. If passed, what would the proposed city charter do? If the measure passes, the proposed city charter would outline details related to the city's form of government, term limits, and some language preferences. The city council would appoint a full-time city manager for an indefinite term to oversee the city's day-to-day operations. The city manager would be an at-will employee who could be fired by a majority of the elected officials, consistent with local laws and their employment agreement. The city manager would not be an elected position. The city council would increase from 5 members to include 7 members, including 6 part-time city councilors and a full-time mayor who would also have voting privileges. The city council would serve as the city's governing body and be responsible for the city's legislative functions. In addition to serving on the city council, the mayor would serve as the chief elected official. All city council positions would be nonpartisan and elected at large by Beaverton voters. Next slide. The city councilors and the mayor would be limited to 3 consecutive 4-year terms in office for their respective positions. A councilor or mayor who reached the 3-term limit would be allowed to run again for election to the same office only after a break in service. The term limit does not prevent a term-limited mayor from running for election as a councilor or a term-limited councilor from running for election as a mayor. The new charter would remove gender-exclusive references. The mayor or councilor under the new charter could be removed from office for unethical or criminal conduct. The city's indebtedness would not be allowed to exceed debt limits imposed by state law. and a public hearing before the City Council will be required to adopt any ordinance. Next slide. What is the role of elected officials under the proposed city charter? If the proposed city charter passes, the council would approve the city's budget and adopt city laws and regulations, set goals and objectives for city staff and city business. They would hire a professional city manager based on that person's education, experience, skills, and abilities, and then supervise the city manager. They would also have the authority to remove the city manager at any time consistent with an employment agreement. Next slide. What is the role of the city manager under the proposed city charter? If the measure passes, the city manager would be an at-will employee who could be fired by a majority of the elected officials consistent with local laws and their employment agreement. The city manager could propose the city budget for consideration by the budget committee and then the mayor and council. City manager could recruit, hire, supervise, and may terminate city staff. City manager could serve as the mayor and council's chief advisor by providing complete and objective information about city operations, providing options for their consideration, offering an assessment of the long-term consequences of decisions, and making recommendations on how to manage the city and deliver city services. City manager could carry out the policies established by the mayor and council, enforce laws and regulations, and implement short and long-range city goals and objectives. Next slide. Thank you. What are some next steps? First is a public vote. The Beaverton City Council referred the proposed city charter to Beaverton voters on the May 19th, 2020 primary election ballot. Second is effective date. If approved, the proposed charter would become operative on July 1st of 2021. Next slide. If passed, what is the cost to taxpayers? The financial impact, if any, due to changes to city positions under the proposed charter would be approximately $42,000 because the proposed city charter would replace or modify existing positions included in the city's current charter. For example, the cost of adding a new city councilor position would be available from a redistribution of the mayor's existing salary to a new councilor position. The cost would be paid by the city's general fund through an existing revenue stream, and there would be no fiscal impact to taxpayers. Next slide. What happens if the proposed city charter does not pass? Well, really nothing happens. The city would continue to operate as it does now under the existing charter. The city's present mayor-council form of government would remain in place, and there would be no fiscal impact. Next slide. Thank you very much. I'll now turn it back to Cynthia.
Thank you, Jim. Now it's time for Q&A. Panel, thank you for being here today to answer our audience questions. For each question, I will pose it to all of you to answer. Before we get started, since we've already had an opportunity to hear from Jim Johnson, I'd like to give Councilor Soucie and Steve Smelley a chance to introduce themselves. Marc, we'll start with you.
Great. Thank you very much, Cynthia. Thank you also to Mr. Johnson for participating in this forum and for the work that he did to help the City Council develop this proposed charter for the City of Beaverton. His experience is fairly extensive and substantial, and we really appreciated the insight he offered to us. My name is Marc Soucie. I've been on the City Council here in Beaverton since November of 2008, so I'm in my 12th year. And I obviously was one of the participants in the development of this proposed charter. And just quickly, the process that we used to develop it is that we had a series of public work sessions at our council meetings starting back in September of 2019. All 5 city councilors and the mayor were part of that process, as was Mr. Johnson and Mr. Kirby, our city attorney, and one other member of the city attorney's staff. There were other staff members who were playing smaller roles in helping things out, but basically the work was done by a long series of discussions and research that were brought together in order to put together a charter that we believe is going to represent the best opportunity for Beaverton to continue to be an excellent city going into the future. Obviously, there's a lot of information available to people on the city website, including the draft charter itself, and the voters' pamphlet statements that everybody should have received in their mailbox contain a lot of perspective and opinions and analysis from people interested. And of course, we're having these forums and the Beaverton Voters Forum coming up at the beginning of May as opportunities for people to learn more about the proposed charter. So with that, I look forward to the questions.
Thank you. Steve, would you like to say a few words?
Sure. I'm Steve Smelley. I'm the founder and owner of Goldfinch Consulting here in Beaverton, a local Beaverton consulting practice. It's the second business that I've started in Beaverton. I'm a member of the Chamber of Commerce, and I serve as the chair of the Business Advocacy Council and the Candidate Endorsement Council for the Chamber. I've been involved in watching the development of the city charter and provided some testimony at one of the two sessions that were held for public testimony on the charter, and took a position against on a personal basis, as well as the charter being opposed by the Chamber of Commerce. So I'll be happy to try to provide some perspective. There's some great work that's been done. I share Councilor Soucie's comments on the work that Jim and the council's done. There's been a lot of good things done in putting some things together for this city charter, but the timing is a challenge, and some of the details and some of the lack of public involvement is the basis of my concern. But happy to take your questions, and hopefully this is informative for the voters and helpful for everybody as they make their decisions. So thank you. Good to join you.
Thank you. Okay, let's get started. For each question, we will rotate the order of who answers first. Our first question is, the offices being voted on during the May election exist under the current city charter. If the new charter is adopted, will not these current offices disappear when the new charter becomes effective, requiring another election to elect persons to the offices arising under the new charter? We're going to start with Jim.
Well, the city officers under the existing charter are the existing charter is the mayor, municipal judge, city attorney, and auditor, and they're in Chapter 5. The charter goes to a vote in November, but it does, I'm sorry, in May, but it doesn't take effect if it passes until January 1st. Under the new charter beginning on January 1st, the city officers don't change. They're still the municipal judge, the city attorney, and the auditor. So therefore, there aren't many changes in the city officers between the old charter and the new charter.
Marc?
Yeah, I'll add to that that the changing a charter does not by itself invalidate any of the elected positions. So all of the current 5 city council positions and the position of mayor in the city of Beaverton would continue to persist. Obviously, with the change in charter, the role of the mayor would be the most significantly affected, but there would still be a mayor position. And whoever wins the mayor's race in this 2020 election would be the mayor in 2021. However, the new charter does add a new city council seat. And what would happen if the charter passes in May is we would then initiate the process of setting up a special election for November of this year to pick somebody to fill that new city council seat.
And Steve?
Yeah, it's a good question. The city officers, I agree with Jim. I think that's true, that those officer positions or the employee positions would remain the same. I think I'm not an attorney, but as I'm reading the proposed charter language, I think under Article 8, the general provisions, there's some references to pending matters. So all rights, claims, causes, and actions, duties, contracts, and legal administrative proceedings exist when the charter takes effect, are unimpaired by this charter. So I think that's the attempt of trying to do that. The concern is that obviously it's significant changes in duties of the mayor. significant changes in duties of and powers and duties of the councilors. So unlike a charter that might just be amended, this is a brand new charter and a brand new form of government. So I think that the question is well placed to be thoughtful about. There is a reference in Article 9 on the transition, also in the new charter language under 9.1, the terms, where there's a statement that for each elected official in office on January 1st of 2020, all preceding consecutive terms served by the elected officials will apply towards a maximum of the 3 consecutive elected 4-year terms allowed under the 2021 charter. So there is a reference to the positions it makes the assumption that the city council positions and mayor positions would be going forward because they're called out in terms of how they're impacted by the term limits. So that's the best information I could give you.
Thank you. Next question. Where is the language in the new charter that the offices under the old charter continue under the new charter? How can you say that the current offices that exist only under the current charter will continue under the new charter, which explicitly creates new offices? We are going to start with Marc.
Well, I have to say I'm not sure I quite understand the positions that the person asking the question is concerned about. I think Mr. Johnson answered the question about the staff officers, the municipal court judge, the city attorney, the auditor. My answer was and remains that the positions of city councilor that are currently in force today are not modified by the change of charter. Charter changes happen not frequently, but regularly in the state of Oregon, as well as in other parts of the United States. This is not an issue that we are aware has ever come up as a legal issue, that somebody who holds a position that is in a term that's intended to extend beyond the transition of charter would in some way be invalidated by the fact that there's a new charter. Our city attorney, I'm sure, could comment further on the legalities behind this, but I don't share the concern, and I don't think the city council or our city attorney shares the concern of the questioner that official positions of the city would be eliminated by the change of charter.
Thank you. Steve?
Yeah, so again, I think that as referenced before, the sections that I just referenced in the charter is as close as I can come to stating anything that suggests that the positions would go forward as they are. I do think that they're materially different, and I do think that it's a good question. I'm not an attorney, so I don't have a legal answer for you in terms of whether it's actually legally factual that the positions go through or not. The specific question was, where in the charter language does it say that they will go forward as elected? And I don't think that in my reading that it does.
Thank you. Jim?
I would just mention and encourage the questioner to look at the city's website. The old city charter and the new city charter are on the website. And you can compare the two and see that the city officers in Chapter 5 of the old charter and Article 4 of the new charter are the same. That is, the city attorney, municipal court and judges, and the city auditor. So those are the same under both charters.
Thank you. Next question. I support the proposed measure to hire a city manager. However, I'm concerned that only $42,000 is budgeted for this position. How can we attract and retain a competent manager with that salary allocation? We are going to start with Steve.
Yeah, the answer is great question, and thanks for the question. The answer is you could not do that for $42,000, but I don't think that that's the intent. I'll tell you that I have no idea where the $42,000 came from. I do believe that it would be an assumption that there would be a reduction in the mayor's salary, an assumption that there would be some efficiencies by a city manager, and an assumption that we would hire a full-time city manager. But as we've discussed before, a city manager would be somewhere north of $100,000 at least.
Jim?
I think Steve is pretty much correct. I would amend his likely salary is probably in the $200,000 range for a city the size of Beaverton, but it's roughly that. I think the $42,000, as Steve mentioned, comes from a net. The city staff looked at a number of expenses now and expenses after and try to determine the net impact.
And Marc?
Yeah, the $42,000 estimate was developed by our finance director working with other members of staff. And I believe that the assumptions that were used were, number one, that the mayor's salary would be reduced, going from an administrative executive mayor full-time to a full-time political mayor, that presumably the city council would reduce the mayor's salary, that there would be one new city council position, which is $19,200 per year. And I believe the estimate that the finance director made presumed that the current holder of the position of assistant to the mayor that position would essentially disappear in favor of the city manager position. I'm not sure that would be the case. I think that's a decision that the council and the newly hired city manager, when that takes place, would have to make. So I think that an estimate is a little bit hard to make right now. I think 42,000 is a low estimate. 200,000 might be a little bit more realistic if you choose not to change that position into a city manager, but just add a city manager. So I think it's a to be determined, but I think I've been consistent in saying through this that the net change to the city would be at most the hiring of a full-time city manager in terms of the number of people employed by the city. Any other changes in employment at the city would be decisions of the city council, which happen all the time anyway.
Thank you. Next question. Regarding Article 7.1, debt. Regarding Article 7.1, debt. City indebtedness may not exceed debt limits imposed by state law. How does state law limit the city of Beaverton's debt limits? We are going to start with Jim.
I think we need the city attorney here to answer some of these questions. I'm going to defer to Marc on this one.
The finance director present for this one.
Yes.
But as I understand it, there is a state law that governs what kinds of debt a municipality can take on. Essentially, just flat out borrowing unsecured monies is something that we get to do as individuals, but governments don't get to do. But when governments borrow money, they're typically borrowing against a revenue stream so that they can make commitments to the people who are lending the money to them, that they can repay those. Those are all permitted under state law. This section of the proposed charter is essentially tidying up of some old language that was in our current charter, which referred to some debt instruments and structures that were commonly used back in the 60s and 70s. And that the writers of the current charter did not want the city to be using. Since that time, 40 years ago, a lot has changed in state law regarding indebtedness and how municipalities manage that. But a more detailed and fully accurate answer to that question has to come from probably our finance director.
Thank you. Steve?
Yeah, this is totally outside of my area of expertise. I can only refer to, under the current charter, under Chapter 10, Section 40, I've got it on my screen and I just looked up, the voluntary floating indebtedness, and there's a talk about not exceeding $25,000 at the time. I think that's the language that Marc was referring to there. It also includes that all city officials and employees who create an officially approved or any indebtedness in excess of the limitation shall be jointly and separately liable for the excess. I don't know if that's what it is currently. I don't know if that's something that's in the state law or not. But I would refer to attorneys to figure out or look at what the state law requirements are to understand what the new language is, because I'm not familiar with it.
Thank you. Next question. What is the benefit of having term limits if the ultimate determination how long one serves is at the ballot box? We are going to start with Marc.
Well, I was one of the proponents for term limits, and I continue to be, although they're generous term limits. And let me describe that because it's a little bit unusual. We're not doing it the way that everybody else does it. 3 consecutive 4-year terms means that somebody could serve 12 years if the voters are willing to return them to office twice. Or if they happen to start with a partial term, they could even go longer. For instance, at the end of the current term that I'm serving, I will have served 14 years because I started with a 2-year partial term. However, sort of following a model we've seen with some other governments, for instance, the Metro Regional government, where they have a 12-year term limit, but a councilor who's reached a 12-year term limit can run to be Metro Council president. That has happened in the past. We decided that was a good model so that if somebody is successful as a councilor and people and that person wants to run for mayor, they can do so and they can serve 12 years as a mayor. The other thing we've added, which is a little bit unusual, but it's meant to respect the interest in that voters may have in keeping a really good person around for a very long time, and I'll tell you, after 12 years, it gets to be a long time, is that if somebody serves 12 years and takes a break, a year or two break, they can come back and run for that position or a different position again. So you could have somebody who serves 24 or 36 years as a city councilor if the voters are willing to return that person to another position. However, in between, there's going to be an opportunity for somebody new and fresh to come in and give a new perspective to the board, to the council.
Thank you. Steve?
I think that the issue of term limits is really a personal preference on the part of voters. Obviously, the voters at the ballot box control the terms of any elected official in any form. This sets some arbitrary limits that reduce the voters' ability to vote out, or not vote out, but to keep somebody that they wanted. With due respect, Marc is right, you could run again if you take a break. So that provides that opportunity, and it's a long term and all those things. But those are personal issues. The council could remove elected officials by the new charter, but the charter limits the ability for somebody to stay longer than what those limits would be if the charter approved.
Jim?
I don't have anything to add. Marc was a very thorough answer on that one.
Thank you. Next question. What process and time frame will there be to hire a city manager? We are going to start with Steve.
I don't know specifically. I would suggest that my reading of the charter language would suggest that if it passes in May, that the city council could start the process sooner than waiting until it's actually in effect in January. So I would assume that they would go into a search fairly immediately after it approves, assuming that the charter approved, and then have somebody ready to go by the time January 1st came in. But I would leave that to Councilor Soucie to answer.
Jim, you're next.
The kind of usual process that councils go through to hire a city manager, and it is up to the council to do that. So they can vary from a usual or regular process. It usually starts with consideration of hiring a recruiter. Councils don't have to do that, but a lot of them do. If they do decide to do that, there's usually a request for proposal. So a number of different recruiters will send in a proposal. Council does interviews and selects a recruiter. Usually the recruiter then will work with city council to do a recruitment brochure. This is a description of the position within the city, a description of the city itself, its goals and objectives, history, and so forth. That recruitment brochure is then read by people all over the country, probably, and is used as the recruiting marketing for the position. Applications are then accepted, and the council or citizens with citizen committee help, perhaps, is they look at the applications received and try to narrow that down to a smaller number. Perhaps 3 to 5 is a usual number. They then do interviews. Sometimes there are various panels. There could be a an employee panel. There could be a city council panel, of course, but also it could be a citizen panel that helps the council in that interview process. Usually then the council selects a top-ranked candidate and then would negotiate a contract with that top-ranked candidate, and then there'd be a starting date that's also negotiated. So that's kind of the usual process, but councils can vary from that if they choose to do so.
Thank you. Marc?
Yeah, we haven't had a detailed discussion at the city council about how this transition would take place because, of course, it is a decision of the voters that has to take place first. If we find on May 19th or May 20th that the voters have approved the charter, my personal opinion is that, first of all, the process would follow more or less the lines that Mr. Johnson has just described, because that's typical. We've been through a similar process here in the city for hiring our city attorney a number of years ago, for hiring a new presiding judge for municipal court. So we do have some experience with this, as well as the experience of watching other local jurisdictions doing the same thing. But I think another important consideration is that this would be a decision of the new council. Come 2021, if this charter passes, we will have no less than 2 new city councilors, because one of the current races on the May ballot is for an open seat. And so there would be 1 new person there. And then if the charter passes, we would need to elect somebody else in November. So you have 2 new councilors. And I don't think this council should be making the decision about who the city manager is. I think it's the next council. So my recommendation will be, if we are able to have this discussion after May 19th, is that this city council chooses an interim city manager to start on January and to help guide the rest of the process, which hopefully we can get started, but that all of the decision making, all the interviewing and decision making would be done by the new council next year.
Thank you. Next question. I would like a more detailed and clear explanation of the positions and costs regarding this proposal. What current positions will be affected if the proposal passes? Will there still be a mayor's office director, a government relations manager, and an assistant director to the mayor in addition to the new city manager? And what will their salaries be? We're going to start with Jim.
Oh, that's a difficult question to answer. The charter actually doesn't address any of those. It establishes a new city manager and changes the role of the mayor, but it doesn't address any of the questions related to other positions, the assistant to the mayor, government relations, and so forth. It is not unusual when a new city manager comes that he or she will look at the organization and perhaps suggest some changes to the city council. But of course, if you don't have a city manager, then he or she is not here to talk about the positions that the questioner is worried about.
Marc?
Yeah, I think Mr. Johnson has described it correctly. It really is the job of the city executive, be it strong mayor or city manager, working with the city council as the controllers of the budget to decide what positions the city needs to have and what positions the city is willing to fund. I believe that if the city charter is adopted and if a city manager comes in, most likely the city manager will want to retain a person serving the functions that the current mayor's office director is doing. It could be that the city wants to fill the currently vacant government relations manager position. I don't know if that's the case or not. That again would be a discussion and negotiation between the city manager and the city council. So it's very hard to be exact, as Mr. Johnson indicated, about what positions would be filled and what positions wouldn't. The only thing that we know for sure, if the charter changes, is that we would need to hire a city manager, and then discussion would take place about what happens next.
Steve?
Yeah, I think that that's part of the challenge of the timing of this ballot measure, and part of the reason for my my position against voting for it. The fact is that there is no way to determine what the needs are. When it comes to the city staff, that stuff, those positions exist at the discretion of the mayor currently, and would exist under the new structure with the budget that would be controlled by the city council, and then with the city manager. The new positions that we know for sure would be incurred, and the cost associated with them that would be incurred under the adoption of the new charter would be a new city manager, and we know that that would be a cost. It could be a net cost of something, but it will be a cost. We would also have the cost of a new city councilor unless the city councilors decide that they're not going to take any compensation. Right now, Marc's doing this. Marc has had me tell him publicly, and I'll say it again, our city councilors are not paid very much. I think it's $19,400 or something like that. I'm pretty close. But given the changes in the roles, and the fact is that the city council would determine the compensation for the mayor, the city councilors, and the city manager, and then the city manager would control the cost of the additional city staff with the advice and under the budget direction of the city council. So if you are a voter, you could reasonably think, what does that mean if the city councilors' jobs are going to increase in expectation? The mayor's job may decrease in expectation. What's that going to be? Who knows what it's going to be? But those are some of the costs that I think are somewhere in this magic 40 some odd $1,000 that has no background that I've seen whatsoever. So there's my answer.
Cynthia is muted.
We'll try that again. Next question. Assuming the charter passes and the mayor's current role is reduced in scope, will whoever is elected mayor receive the current salary for his or her term, regardless of whether city council approves a commensurate salary reduction? And we are going to start with Marc.
I would expect that should the charter pass and the role of the mayor change, that the city council would indeed modify the pay received by the mayor. We have not discussed that to the point where you could say that there's a unanimous or even a 3-2 vote to do that. However, I think there's a presumption that underlies all of our discussions about changing the role of the mayor, that a mayor who is not an executive would not be paid as much as a mayor who is an executive. But we have not discussed numbers. What we would do is look at comparables, look at similar circumstances in other governments around, and come up with a number that we think reflects the work that the mayor will have to do, which is substantial, by the way, which is why the new charter says full-time mayor. We want to make sure that the amount is appropriate, but not excessive.
Steve?
Yeah, so the only way to answer that in terms of when that happens is exactly what Marc's saying. It'll be determined by the council at a later time. In the Article 9 transition plan, it says that the compensation of, under 9.2, the compensation of the mayor and each councilor when this charter takes effect must continue in effect until changes in accordance with the provisions of the charter. So in the provisions of the charter, they can change it after that, but at the election point and at the initial point of the charter, there would be no changes at that point in time, is my understanding. The current salary of the mayor under the current charter is limited to, it has to be at least 80% of a district judge district court judge for the state of Oregon. I believe that the current compensation of the mayor may be a little bit higher than that currently. And so there is room for an adjustment under the current charter to reduce the mayor's salary, and that could be happening today if the city council decided to do that. I don't think that that's their intent, and they've been very clear at not wanting to disrupt compensation of current positions and all that kind of thing. So that's the best information I could give you.
Thank you. Jim?
I don't have anything to add. I think Steve and Marc did a good job on that question.
Thank you. Next question. Removal from office. Why is it better that a majority of the council can remove the mayor rather than leaving that up to the voters of Beaverton, who already have the right of recall under the Oregon Constitution? We are going to start with Steve.
Yeah, so elected officials in the state of Oregon, by the state constitution, the removal of an elected official, that right is typically embedded in the voters. So this would be a change from that in the case of both the removal of a mayor or, quite frankly, another city councilor. If this passed in Beaverton and withstood any potential legal challenges against the state constitution, I have no idea if that would be the case or not, but if that withstood that and was legal, then you're exactly correct. The new charter would allow the city councilors, a body of five of the seven, could remove any of the other city councilors. They could remove the mayor, and they also cover the censure and discipline that way as well. So that's the factual piece that I can give you.
Jim?
I have the appropriate paragraph before me, and I'll read it to you. It's section 3.10, remove from office. In addition to censure and discipline, the council may remove a council member, which would include the mayor, after notice and an opportunity to be heard if a member of 5 members of the council determine that the council member A is convicted of a crime punishable by a term of imprisonment, B has violated any applicable rule of government ethics, 3 fails to participate in at least one council meeting within a 60-day period without notifying the council, D fails to qualify for the office within 30 days of the scheduled date of assuming office, or E coerces the city manager in violation of section 3.4. So the voters of Beaverton, in passing this charter, would give the authority to the city council, 5 members, that would be a supermajority, to go ahead after notice and after an opportunity to be heard to remove someone from office for those items. This actually received quite a bit of discussion by the city council during the work sessions. And I'll pass it on to Marc to talk to you about what they discussed.
Thank you. Marc?
And not one of those terms that Mr. Johnson just read from the proposed charter has anything to do with political disagreements or disagreements about policy. This is about criminal violations and ethical violations. It comes from our research into what some other cities around the country have in their charters to address issues where somebody has committed crimes and is still holding office, or when somebody has committed a gross breach of ethical conduct. One example that I noted that was fairly fresh, in fact, you can continue to read about it, is in Washington, D.C., where the city council in D.C. was in the process of voting one of their members off the council for persistent violation of ethical rules in Washington, D.C. by favoring his friends and associates with business deals that were controlled by his authority as a city councilor. And after numerous efforts to get this person to stop doing that, finally 12 of the 13 councilors were about to vote to remove him from office when he decided to resign. And so that looked interesting. So we looked at that charter, and it turns out they have a provision similar to what we have here. It's a tricky point. The League of Oregon Cities addresses this in their model charter for cities, but their list includes only the very last one about coercing the city manager. And we felt it was important to allow a city council to address ethical violations by one of their members, because gross violation of ethics, say in the first year of somebody's term, still leaves you with an unethical elected person until that person can be either recalled or removed from office at a regular election. So we felt this is an important thing for safety for the city. We expect it never to be used.
Thank you. Next question. Elections. The new charter requires this new 6th member of the council to run for election in the November 2020 election. Why should not the mayor and remaining councilors, when the old charter is repealed, also run for election in November to the new offices, which are materially different under the new charter? Why should they get to continue in office without running in November? And we are going to start with Jim.
Well, I think if I recall, the positions of mayor and council, that if the person gets more than 51% in the May election, then they're elected. If they do not receive that, then they are on the ballot in November in a runoff election. Is that right, Marc?
Marc?
Well, for the people who are running for council seats in this May election, Mr. Johnson's right. I mean, they either will be elected in May or they will need to run off in November. I think the questioner was after something different, which would have been a different approach to doing this charter amendment, which would be to say, okay, City Council, you want to change the charter, then all of you have to run for re-election to prove that you're worthy of being city councilors under the new charter. And that's a fair position to take. It's a little bit stronger than the one I would take, and it's certainly not the one the City Council chose to take. I think the questioner is overestimating the modification of the role of City Council. The main change to our role of those of us who are not full-time mayors is that we have some authority over the hiring and potentially the dismissal of a city manager. The role of policymaking, the role of developing programs and procedures for the city would be a little bit stronger for the City Council under the new charter, but not massively so, because the administrative authority would remain with a city manager. So I think that our council felt pretty strongly that the introduction of term limits and the fact that we have members up for election every 4 years anyway was sufficient reason for voters to be able to influence who is leading them under the new charter.
Thank you. Steve?
Yeah, so I don't know. I think that ultimately it's a choice of the voters to make. The voters have to make the decision on whether or not they agree that the change in the charter is insignificant enough in change of duties for the city councilors, for instance, or there is certainly the mayor's position is materially different. And I think that the voters have to decide that when they go to the ballot in May to vote on this charter. Because if they believe that those council positions have changed significantly, they do change in the fact that they hire the manager that would be the administrative leader of the city. They do change in the fact that any 5 of them could censure or remove an elected official. There's some other significant changes in power to the city council that are embedded in this new charter. If the voter believes that those are significant enough changes and that they think that they would be warranting a new election to elect people into those new roles, then they should vote against the charter. If they believe that those are not significant changes and that everybody is, or that they are significant changes and everybody is qualified under the new roles, then they should, they could vote for the charter and not have re-elections. But that's the basic challenge that I see that the voter is being faced with. The voter has to make that decision.
Thank you. Next question. Would council members' salaries or stipends change? We will start with Marc.
No, the change of charter does not affect councilor pay in any way. Decisions about councilor pay are independent decisions that are made as part of the budgeting process. And if I recall correctly, and please don't quote me on this, I would have to consult with our city attorney to validate what I believe my understanding is. I don't think the city council can actually change city councilor pay. I think that the non-elected members of our budget committee have to do that. At least that has been the tradition that has happened during the time I've been on the council when there have been a few increases in councilor pay. I believe that city councilors can advocate for changes in their pay, but if I understand correctly, it is the non-elected members of the budget committee that make that decision as to whether or not council pay should change. This charter, if my understanding is correct, this charter would not change that situation.
Thank you. Steve?
So under Article 3 of the new charter, under, 3.1K, it states, so if you pass this charter, it states the council must determine the compensation of the mayor and councilors, but no change in compensation is effect for the mayor or councilors in office when the decision is made. The changes in compensation take effect at the start of the term following the end of the term for each council member in office when the determination was made. So I do believe that the council does, they must determine their own compensation as well as that of the mayor. And then it's just a matter of when the timing is that goes into effect. So what that determination is or what that salary is, it's up to the councilors. They have the power to do that if this charter passes.
Jim?
Just to add on to what Steve said, he's correct that the wording is the council must determine the compensation, but the council can also choose to use a salary review committee. They could use the citizen member of the budget committee, all to make recommendations to the council on what that compensation should be. In the end, they make that final determination, but there's lots of different ways of doing that.
Thank you. Next question. Now, under Oregon law, the voters decide whether to recall a public official for bad conduct. Why do you want to take that right from Beaverton voters and give it only to a 7-member majority of the council? We are going to start with Steve.
I can't speak to the intent other than what Marc described earlier, and that is, some concern over some cities that have had problems, and so they wanted the ability to make those decisions faster than the ballot box would allow, perhaps. But other than that, it's something that you would expect that the voters would take care of those issues at the ballot box. But given the terms that we're talking about, that could be a while to take somebody out.
Jim?
I would just add to what Steve said by mentioning that the voters of the city of Beaverton, in approving the charter, are giving this authority to the city council. So in that respect, the citizens or the residents who are voting are giving that authority to the council.
Thank you. Marc?
While not removing the authority of the voters, all of the mechanisms currently in state law that allow for recall or the natural course of elections would remain in force. The voters will always have the ability to recall. So, for instance, if one of these dire circumstances were to occur and a person were convicted of ethical violations and a 5-member majority of the council were to remove that person, then if voters significantly disagreed with that decision, they could recall those councilors who made that decision. The point of this was to allow for a responsible city council to take action sooner, faster than the recall process would allow. The recall process is not a simple process. It requires getting signatures from a substantial number of voters. Beaverton has a much more substantial number of voters than it did a long time ago. And so it can take quite some time. And if you have significant ethical behavior issues, or if you have significant criminal behavior, or if you have, frankly, somebody who's just not showing up to the meetings and is, for whatever reason, abdicated their position, it's very challenging to deal with that when you have no tools. And so this is a tool that would be available as what I consider a last resort, without modifying the voters' ability to use the power of recall if they wish.
Thank you. Next question. I attended both public hearings. The feeling in the room from citizens clearly was not for a charter change based on the overwhelming majority of the testimony by the citizens of Beaverton. How do you respond to this? We are going to start with Jim.
Cynthia, you were cut off there in the last part of the question. If you could read that again, please.
I'm happy to repeat. I attended both public hearings. The feeling in the room from citizens clearly was not for a charter change based on the overwhelming majority of the testimony by the citizens of Beaverton. How do you respond to this?
Well, the city council has lots of choices in terms of how it reaches a decision and how it involves citizens in that decision. Public hearings are one way of doing that. In terms of the total number of people that were at that public hearing, it was a relatively small number and therefore a small percentage of the population of Beaverton. But the council has chosen to use other ways of determining that, other ways of getting public solicitation of their opinion on the new charter. So I think in the end, the council just decided that this was best for the city and decided to proceed.
Marc?
Yeah, I know I personally took notes about all of the testimony we received at the public hearings that we held with respect to the charter. The majority of the concern was about timing, about doing this in May rather than November, which is a topic that we discussed in the first information session and may yet discuss in this one. But I think Mr. Johnson, identifies a key point, which is that we are responsible to all 100,000 people in Beaverton, not just to the people who came to the public hearing. We did listen to the comments in the public hearing. I think there was probably a disagreement that you heard afterwards about timing, because we did choose to put this on the May ballot. I would personally have loved to have a much more involved public engagement process with this charter development, but let's just say that it wasn't a priority of the city to do widespread public engagement on a city council-led charter development project that did not have the full support of everybody in the top ranks of the city. So given that challenge, we decided that it was best for us to focus on our own expertise, the expertise of Mr. Johnson, the expertise of our city attorney's office, and gather input in as many ways as we could, including public hearings, but also we got lots of input by email and by conversations with people that were contacting us during the process.
Steve?
I also attended both of those public hearings, and I do agree that there was limited participation. The first session, there were only 2, I believe, that testified. There were only about 5 in the room at the time. The second one, we had a more packed house, if you will, but still limited feedback. There were people who spoke in favor, people who spoke neutral, and people who spoke against. To Marc's point, I believe that the public hearing, the consistency of the feedback was that the timing was wrong to put this on the May ballot. That was the consistency in that small sample size. Now, I'm certain that all of the city councilors have been getting feedback from their constituents. No question. I have no idea how that has occurred. I know that when the city did the visioning process, they reached out to, I think 8,000 citizens to try to get a qualified amount of feedback proactively. In this case, I'm not aware of that proactive reach out. It was, if you wanted to come to the 9 work sessions, they were open. If you wanted to come to the 2 sessions for a public hearing, they were open and available to you. But outside of that, you'd have to reach out to your counselor or reach out to those who are involved in the process and insert yourself in that process. So the timing is the concern, and I would suggest that where the city councilors have done an excellent job, and Jim has helped them in that process in looking at best practices and doing the research and the homework, and there's a lot of work that they've put into it, and they've used a lot of good resources, including the National Civic League resources. But even in that National Civic League resources, there would be a suggestion that a charter committee with a broad, diverse group of citizens be participatory in the process of a charter change. And something that's this significant in size, something that was described as akin to a constitution, making a change to a document that important should require more citizen involvement. And that's the reason for my and the chamber's belief that this should not be on the May ballot, that it should involve more citizen feedback.
Thank you. Next question. What is the perceived need for this change and who initiated it? We are going to start with Marc.
Okay, this is kind of the heart of the matter when you really get down to it. Beaverton has grown a lot in the 40 years since the current charter was established. I think back then the population of the city was somewhere in the 30 to 40,000 range. We're more than twice the size. We have a lot more people. We have a lot more, we don't have a lot more geography. We have more geography. We have a lot more projects, a lot more programs of the city. The city government is larger. There's more staff. We have a wonderful staff, but there's over 600 of them. The job of managing the day-to-day details of the administration, the staff, the projects, the programs, the interaction with the public, all of those things is a substantial job. And at the same time, Beaverton is a highly influential city in this region, in this state, and to an increasing degree of across the country through work being done at the U.S. Conference of Mayors, at the National League of Cities, and other places where we participate. The job of managing the day-to-day details and the job of leading the city's external activities, its legislative work, its policy development work, its program development work. In the opinion of the City Council, it is too big for one person now. And we believe that this is the time for the City of Beaverton to bring in professional management that subscribes to the International City Managers Association Code of Ethics, that has experience working in a city of our size and managing the day-to-day details, which would allow the mayor, as a full-time mayor in the city of Beaverton, to continue the work of leadership, to continue the work of representation of the city, to continue the work with the city council of developing ordinances and resolutions and intergovernmental agreements and development and disposition agreements and all the other business that we do, but to do it without having to fuss over the day-to-day details about which sewer has backed up or which police officer needs a new car or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That we would love to see a city manager taking care of, and let the mayor do the leadership job that the mayor should be doing for us all across the country.
Steve?
Yeah, so my understanding as to why this is needed, I agree with Marc that the intent, at least what I followed, is an update and bringing it current to the changing needs of the city. If I would to offer my observations of the history, this started with some concerns over that city manager type level of position, it appears, and then it got into compensation of the mayor, and then it got into discussions about what we were going to do with that, and then how can the city council get the right information that they need to fulfill their roles correctly, and so there was all of those kinds of things built in. We looked at the city charter, and of course the current city charter has some gender biased language that needed to be cleaned up, and so then it kind of evolved and snowballed from my perspective into, it started as one thing and ended up being a massive project, taking on lots of things. And I think that the councilors have done a great job of trying to tackle everything that they could see wrong because they want it to last another 40 years or more. And so I applaud their efforts and the hard work that they've put into it. I just think that now is not the time without having more feedback. So,
Thank you. Jim?
Steve, as an opponent, and Marc as a proponent, have done a good job of answering it. My role is a bit more neutral than the two of them. So,
Thank you. Next question. What is the cost of this charter revision program, including the fee charged by Mr. Johnson? We are going to start with Steve.
I have no idea. I can tell you that my involvement in this process cost the city absolutely zero. I'm just here as a citizen, and I have no idea what money has been spent on any consulting or any of the new positions or any of that kind of stuff. So I'll defer to my panelists.
Jim?
The contract is between Portland State University and the city of Beaverton, working through the city attorney's office. It's roughly around $10,000 paid hourly based on the number of hours that we spend on the project helping the city. I attended, I think, 8 or 7 of the 9 work sessions working with council, worked with city attorney on some possible language changes, attended the public hearings, and then have participated in the public involvement sessions. So it's around $10,000.
And Marc?
Which, by the way, was an enormous bargain because Jim's experience is massive. I hope people took note of the number of times he has been a city manager or interim city manager or a county administrator. That is it's incredibly valuable perspective, and it helped buttress the perspective we were able to gain from work with fellow city councilors and mayors around the state of Oregon, who almost exclusively work within a council manager form of government, and gave us a lot of insight into what some of the positives and negatives were. I think that spending $10,000 and some staff time from our city attorney's office was a bargain. But frankly, you know, if the city were to really get behind doing something like this, they would spend a lot more money doing public outreach. That wasn't the reason that we didn't do the public outreach. I would have been delighted to spend the money and the staff time to do that.
Thank you. Next question. What is a fair salary for a ceremonial mayor? We are going to start with Jim.
Well, I think what would likely happen is that the council would look at cities throughout Oregon. What is the mayor being paid? Would also look at cities around the country. And I say that because there are not many full-time mayors around the state of Oregon. There are around the country. But there are also not a lot of mayors that are not a strong mayor form of government who are also full-time. So it's going to be a little interesting for the council to look at comparable positions. My guess is that they're probably going to look at a department head salary or something like that, a division manager within the city. It is a full-time position with some benefits. So they'll take a look at it and try to make the best decision they can.
Marc?
Well, I will mention that one of my other interests as a city councilor has been exploring pay scales and pay rates for elected people around the country. We had some discussions at city council meetings in 2019 about the level of pay going to our current mayor under the current strong mayor charter. And during some of that research, I was able to pull together information from a number of cities around the country that demonstrated that our mayor is well, let's just say well compensated. When you look at not strong mayors, mayors who operate under a council manager form of government, but who are full-time mayors, that includes mayors of some very large cities, millions of residents. I mean, a lot of places have council manager forms of government. Where the mayor is full-time. That's a fairly common circumstance. And then you can look at local comparables too. For instance, the Metro regional government has 7 elected councilors, one of whom is a council president. The council president's full-time. They are, however, a council manager form of government. They hire a COO, a chief operating officer, who serves for Metro the same function that a city manager would serve for Beaverton under our new charter. And the council president at Metro is paid by the Metro charter the same amount as a circuit court judge, which is a salary set by the state legislature. So that's about $134,000, $135,000, somewhere in that range. So I would look at that as one of the kinds of comparables that we would explore, as well as other cities in the state. But essentially, you look for a role where full-time duties are expected, where political representation, and let me just dispel the belief that this would be a ceremonial position. A full-time mayor, even without administrative responsibilities for the city of Beaverton, would not be a ceremonial job. There is a ton of work to do. And if you want to join the mayor in all the committees that the mayor would be sitting in on, volunteer for that. You won't do it for more than about 3 days.
Thank you. Steve?
Yeah, I think that both Jim and Marc have outlined it fairly well. Mayor or city councilors or any publicly elected official, their compensation may or may not actually match what is in the private sector world, because there's a part of an elected position oftentimes that is considered to be sort of your civic service and your duty and that sort of thing. And so there's part of that that provides a discount for the compensation for whatever the roles and requirements are. The job would be a full-time mayor, though, as Marc said, and it is a heavy full-time lifting job. The things that are removed in this position are just the day-to-day administrative management responsibilities of running city operations. Other than that, everything else still exists. So to suggest that we're going to have a huge savings in cost? I don't know. The only answer I can tell you is it would be up to the city councilors to decide if this passed, just as it is today, with a limitation on how low it can go for the salary of the compensation of the mayor, which I think is around $106,000 is what it can go down to under the current charter.
Thank you. Next question. Can we get a breakdown of the $42,000 to show how it was derived? This should be on the slide set that was shown earlier. We are going to start with Marc.
I will ask that our city staff consult with the finance director and see if the finance director's estimate can be put out on a slide on the city website. I think it's a great request, and everybody should have an opportunity to see that estimate. And I will say for the third time now that I would give a different number. It would be a higher number.
Steve?
Oh, sorry, I didn't hear you. Yes, I agree with Marc. I do believe it would be a higher number. I think it would be fantastic if the city would provide clarity for the voters on that. And if for whatever reason they're not able to provide clarity, then the voter has to make an estimate on their own, in my opinion. To rely on a number that you can't back up with anything is read through the material and come up with your own number if they're not going to back it up.
And Jim?
Marc's correct. If city staff could provide that, that would be a great addition.
Thank you. Next question. Jim shared that under the new charter, the city council can remove a member, which would include the mayor, for unethical behavior. That is an elected office by the people. Does that not conflict with the people's right to elect and recall elected officials according to the state constitution recall process? We are going to start with Steve.
Yeah, so that sounds similar to a question that we had before. And so, yeah, the removal of the office, Jim had read before the section 3.1 on the reasons and the ways that somebody could be removed from elected office. And I think that the reality is that while in the state of Oregon, that is something that's given to the electors, as Jim has indicated before and we've discussed before, if you vote for this charter, you're voting to give up that right as an elector under certain circumstances and give that right, cede that right to the city council, which would allow more expedient removal of office if it was necessary and warranted for whatever unethical behavior was described and followed into the provisions in section 3.1.
What I would add is that if the city council does not proceed with section 3.10 to remove, the voters can still use the recall procedure if they disagree with the city council. In addition, they can recall city councilors for going ahead with paragraph 3.10. So there's a number of ways that they can still use state law if they either do or don't like what the city council is doing.
And Marc?
Yeah, I'll just briefly disagree with the wording that Steve used. The voters do not give up any rights. What the new charter does is it allows the city council to step in before the voters need to step in. Every right that the voters have with respect to recall remains. And as I mentioned in the answer to the previous similar question, if the voters disagree with the choice of the city council to intervene, they can choose to recall those councilors that intervened.
Thank you. Well, that is all the time we have today. Thank you again to our panelists for participating. Just a reminder, if you would like more information on the proposed charter, including a draft of the proposed charter, please go to beavertonoregon.gov/charter. If your question was not answered and you would like it answered, please email citymail@beavertonoregon.gov. The proposed charter ballot measure will also be featured at the upcoming virtual Spring Voters Forum taking place Monday, May 4th at 7 p.m. For more information on all the races being featured at the Voters Forum, as well as instructions for how to virtually access the event when the time comes, please visit beavertonoregon.gov/votersforum. Ballots will be mailed out on April 29th. For a listing of Beaverton ballot drop-off locations, please visit beavertonoregon.gov/elections. Thank you everyone for watching this morning. Have a great weekend.